Hello and welcome to Changemakers. In this program, we have interesting conversations with guests who are making a change, making a difference, making an impact. Our guest today is Fred Luskin, director of the Stanford Forgiveness Project and author of 3 books, Forgive for Good, Stress-Free for Life, Stress-Free for Good, and Forgive for Love. Fred is going to talk to us today about how forgiveness can lead to happiness, and forgiveness can lead to kindness, and kindness can lead to happiness. Fred, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Nice to be here, too. So one of the things that struck me is when I think of Stanford University, you think of a computer science professor, an economics professor, maybe the basketball team, or a medical specialist. But a professor of forgiveness?
Yeah, I know.
How did that happen?
It's weird. And when I first started, people would ask me all the time, like, isn't Stanford supposed to be researching real stuff, not this squishy nonsense? And I once tried to get an interview with the Palo Alto Weekly when we were just starting, and they looked at me like, what are you doing, like forgiveness? The world has changed, and people are responsive now, but they weren't when we started.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that squishy nonsense.
Yeah, the squishy
forgiveness.
nonsense.
How did you even get into it? And there again, I think of like something like forgiveness. You hear about it from the Dalai Lama or the Pope or your priest. But a professional like you, working in an academic research professional like you, how did you get into squishy nonsense?
Well, 2 reasons. One is I myself had been very badly hurt, and I had been abandoned by a very close friend and was miserable, and spent years like building up resentment and bitterness and just struggled. My heart was like ripped out, and I didn't know really what to do, and almost circumstance pushing from people close to me to like change. Nothing worked until something just said, let it go. And letting it go made a difference and changed me, and that got filed away in there like, wow, being a psychologist didn't work, complaining about it didn't work, being bitter didn't work, and opening back up worked. And then when I was getting my PhD at Stanford, I had to come up with a dissertation topic. And for many years, my interest had been that relationship between spiritual practice and health. And I was very intrigued by the question, and it was a question 15 years ago, more than an answer, of do the virtues as the religious spiritual traditions define them, do they make you healthier and happier? There was no empirical evidence. So I picked forgiveness in part because I could, and in part because it had been so hard for me to do a dissertation study, a randomized study, on a forgiveness methodology based in large part what had worked for me.
I see.
So
So across the years, all these wisdom traditions have known through years of experience and practicing that, whether it's you pick up the Bible or one of the Buddha's teachings or Hindu scriptures, they all talk about the same, that forgiveness can actually lead to more kindness and more happiness.
It's true.
But it looks like what you were doing in a university setting, in a laboratory setting, actually testing it and bringing some evidence to it so that a skeptical world could believe it.
And the truth is that has happened from the very beginning of when we started to get data which showed that it could lower blood pressure or that it could reduce stress, or we even were able to show that people like mothers whose children were murdered could, through forgiveness, reduce some of their anguish. The closer we came to physical health and tangible things, the more the media and the world was interested. So I was interviewed by the New York Times and put on the Today Show and all this stuff because here it is, science showing, as you said, these 2,000 or 3,000-year-old traditions, which have been saying forever. Science is showing this little tiny, tiny bit of data, but the Western world needed data. And so we got the opportunity to promote this pretty much all over the world because of the data.
So let's just imagine for a minute that I carry a lot of resentment. I'm mad against a friend or a spouse. Something terrible happened. I am refusing to let go. And I know you'll say, buy a copy of the book and read it. But instead here I'm sitting in front of you with all this resentment brewing. what is the 7-step program or the
Well,
3 things I need to do that you advise in this book?
Okay. One of the things you need to do is feel your pain.
Yeah.
That there is no shortcut in an honest life to completely eliminate suffering. And there's a lot of challenge to be able to hold one's pain appropriately. So if you lose an important relationship or you lose trust in an important person, there's suffering. And probably a good part of this process is to be okay with that suffering. Not to linger in it when it's unnecessary, but not to avoid it either. And so one of the things that I would say to you is, where are you in this process? Mm-hmm. Did it happen 3 weeks ago, or did it happen 30 years ago?
Okay.
If it happened 3 weeks ago, suffer. If it happened 30 years ago, stop suffering. So that's the first step. The second step is to understand how much of the process of the suffering after the grief part is your own doing. Through the way you talk about it, through the way you think about it, through who you blame, and how much stress comes into your body. So if you're like just living your normal day and you think, I have a good life, I have a nice job, I'm happily married, and my boss is an idiot. The minute you think my boss is an idiot, you're all stressed. Yeah. So one of the things that we came up with was, okay, when people say their boss is an idiot, relax. So we taught and teach stress management practices immediately upon the thoughts that cause the stress. So that's another thing I might teach you.
Okay.
A third thing I might teach you is make sure that story you tell doesn't paint you as a victim. That you have control over the story, not the story having control over you. So those would be 3 simple things that I would teach you. Feel the pain appropriately, practice managing the stress that comes up when you're upset, and change that story out of poor me, I'm a victim.
Okay. And if I were to summarize it, I mean, it seems like the undercurrent of all this is taking unconditional responsibility for your life, no matter what the circumstances are.
After grieving the wound.
Okay.
Because there has to be a place where there is a disintegration of a personality. So if you give me a minute, I'll explain that.
Sure.
When we are hurt in a way that we can't get over, part of it is because we don't have schema or cognitive plots or maps of what actually happened, that this thing happened that was so different than we pictured it, that we don't know how to incorporate this information into our view. So let me give an example. You come home, you think you have a good marriage, and your wife, is in bed with the Dallas Cowboys, right? That's a sign that your marriage isn't what you thought it is.
Yes.
But if you have this schema of, we're married, nothing's going to shake it up, she has to be faithful, and, this will never happen to me, this blows it apart. And there's a cognitive disorganization. There's no place safe in the world when this has been blown up, and people need time to get back to safety.
Okay.
And so part of that is holding the grief emotionally, but dealing with the cognitive confusion and changes that happen.
In response to that.
And then, only after the explosion has subsided can one become responsible.
Okay. And now, since you're a scientist and you've been testing it, I'm kind of curious. So what is going on in the body at a chemical cellular level when I carry the resentment, when I refuse to forgive, and what happens when I do change states to forgiveness? I know you've been testing it and measuring it.
Well, what's so amazing is if you watch someone and you say, okay, just picture somebody you hate, and you can hook them up to EKGs and EEGs, and you can track the chemicals coming into that heart and the calcification in their arteries and all this stuff. And you notice when anybody is thinking of somebody they hate, almost every bodily system is in distress. So their heart rate is pounding, and the blood is surging through the vessels, and the immune system is struggling, and the nervous system's all jangled, and the muscles are all tense. When you say, okay, just for an experiment, the person didn't mean you any harm, and you're okay with your suffering. It's not necessarily that you like it, But you don't have to hate them. You can hold your pain, maybe with some compassion for your own suffering. And all of a sudden you notice all the body things calming down, and all of the things that look like an injured organ or system releasing. And it's throughout the entire physiology, from the brain waves here to the amount of tension throughout your feet and all the muscles. It's night and day.
So by extension of that, I would ask is if it's too inconceivable to imagine, you could actually create some kind of a device attached to someone.
Yeah.
So when you're stressed, a red light goes on, it immediately says, and when you calm down, the light turns green.
People have done that.
Okay. Biofeedback?
Yeah, biofeedback, or you can do it through a Holter monitor hooking up to your heart rhythm. The simplest is just something that catches some of the electrical impulses in your finger.
Yeah.
You know?
A personal forgiveness device.
Well, it's more an awareness device.
Sure.
You still have to decide to forgive.
Got it.
But you can see that your body's under stress.
You get some feedback.
Right.
So, you mentioned this example of walking home and finding a spouse with the Dallas Cowboys.
With the Dallas Cowboys, especially if you're not a Cowboy fan.
Yes.
Right.
But I want to use that as a transition to talk about your second book, which was Forgive for Love. So you went from just basic forgiveness to actually how to find deep love. And tell me about the transition. What was the essence of that book?
Well, part of that was personal, which is that it was a period of time where I had a little more struggle in my marriage than I was comfortable with.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that my wife had done anything. It was just a life transition. One of our children had grown up and moved away from home, and I was just in a period of time where it was hard, and I wasn't seeing my life as full.
Yeah.
And it was a challenge for me to feel like full-bodied and full-hearted to anything. And so I decided to see if I could really reorient these general methods towards couples. And that was the genesis for Forgive for Love. And what I wrote it was a way to use forgiveness not just to help a couple get over when the Dallas Cowboys came in and took up residence in your house, but as a way to look forgivingly at your relationship from the beginning. That your partner is going to disappoint you, they're going to do things you don't like, and they're going to screw up. And it seemed to me that forgiveness was one of those tools that should be available to people from the beginning to head off like the catastrophes and the contempt that comes into relationships. So I envisioned it as forgiveness as a tool of wellness and prevention as much or more as after the Dallas Cowboys have shown up.
Got it. And I like one particular line in the book where you say, for better or for worse, you didn't stand in the line where they were giving up saints and slaves as your spouse. You just stood in the line where they were serving up ordinary people with their flaws and just coming to that realization.
Well, and I remember one woman triggered me into this whole line of thinking because she was so furious at her husband. And the guy...
He wasn't a saint, unfortunately.
Well, and here's what I'm thinking, that she was acting as if somehow this guy was dropped out of the sky into bed with her. Like all of a sudden she's minding her own business, this guy falls out of the sky, he's sitting next to her, and she looks at him, where'd you come from? Instead of choosing him, dating him, deciding to marry him, spending 5 years with him, I saw that people act like victims in a situation which they have completely chosen. And they've chosen somebody who's probably as screwed up as they are. So that's where you begin.
Yeah, and a big part of that seemed to be the point that you make, that we are every bit as flawed as all the other people we think are flawed, and just that acceptance and coming to terms with that.
Well, do you know the poignant truth is if we was with somebody so much healthier than we are, we would feel inadequate. And if we were with someone who was so much less healthy than we are, we would leave. So most relationships where there's a big disparity in intimacy needs, ability to communicate, game playing, they don't stay together. It's that when people have a certain bandwidth, it doesn't have to be like this, but it can be like this, but their ways of dealing with their fear of intimacy are different, but their fear of intimacy is the same. Like, just to give you an example,
Yeah.
if you had a very healthy person who could go to, let's talk it out, let's not talk it out, let's argue, let's let it go, if they had that kind of bandwidth, they wouldn't be comfortable with somebody whose only style is, I can't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you got somebody whose only style is, I can't talk about it, and somebody else whose only style is, you got to talk about it,
Yeah.
they're pretty equal, even though they may be polarized. That's how we choose our marriage partner, is equal, but usually polarized.
Right. So at this point where your friend's saying what's happened to Fred, he's gone from squishy nonsense like forgiveness to squishier nonsense like
Squishier
marriage
nonsense
therapy.
with couples. You know, we have almost a 50% divorce rate in this country.
Correct.
40% first marriages, 60% second marriages, 70% third marriages.
It gets worse.
It gets worse. And so clearly people are not learning how to forgive.
Yeah. And you believe that that is the most important vital ingredient to a healthy relationship?
It's not the most important. The research shows it to be generally among the top 10, often among the top 5 to 7, that successful couples learn to forgive.
I see.
That you can't maintain a 20 or 30 or 40-year relationship with another human being without having lots to forgive.
Right. And a strong, I sense a strong element of compassion in all of these things that you're talking about.
It's profound.
And that's a good transition to talk about. You were recently at the United Nations
Yeah.
at the TED conference on compassion.
I was.
And what did you talk about there?
I talked about the relationship between compassion and forgiveness.
Which is?
One of the things that makes forgiveness easier
Yeah.
is if we can hold our own suffering with compassion, not resentment. That we can look at our own woundedness and feel the poignancy of pain, but we don't need to make an enemy.
Right.
We can say, wow, this hurts, this is hard, it's very difficult to be in a couple. That's different than hating my wife.
Yeah.
The other place that forgiveness is so dependent on compassion is one of the major ways that we stop ourselves from forgiving is by thinking we're special in our suffering, that somehow a unique thing has happened to us.
Yeah.
Nothing unique ever happens to people. So a compassion that broadens our sphere from an over-examination of our pain and just looks around and seeing how much pain human beings have, we have a piece of it. Those two are some of the most important directions that I push people during my forgiveness work. To have compassion for one's own piece of the pie and from realizing that suffering is everywhere and don't exaggerate your own.
Right. And so through all of this, there is also an element of reducing stress in general in our lives. And
Yes.
is that how you sort of transitioned to now let me talk about how people can live
I started
a less
as a
stressful
stress
life?
researcher.
Okay.
I had a full-time job in different positions at Stanford's medical school from 1995 till about 2006 as a researcher in preventive cardiology focusing on stress. Stress was the domain that I was working in.
Yeah.
One of the things that I understood was that unforgiveness is self-induced stress. And that was the central way that I figured out how to teach it and how I was able to take these research ideas and spread them all over the place. Because instead of making forgiveness a spiritual or an ethical question, I made it a stress question.
Great. So it appeals to more people.
And everybody gets that.
Yeah.
So
let's switch to your third and most recent book, then, Stress-Free for Life. And given that we live in a neighborhood, in a place, in a community with an extreme amount of stress wherever you look, if we were to give like the simple tips from that book that for our audience, what do you recommend for?
Well, even
I can't say stress-free. I don't think we'll ever get to a point, but at least a reduced stress life.
But even ironically, I'm doing that work at the company you work at.
That's right.
At Google.
Yeah.
I'm teaching stress management.
Yes.
A couple of very simple ones. One is the whole, not the whole, but one of the things that the yogis discovered 3,000 years ago or so was that the rate and depth of our breathing was the link between the parts of the nervous system that get you agitated and the parts of the nervous system that calm you down. Slow, deep, full breathing is parasympathetic or calming, and quick, shallower, higher level, higher up here breathing is the arousal state. Yeah. So most stress management ends up trying to deepen and slow the breathing. Mm-hmm. So the simplest stress management technique is to teach that directly. Okay. Second, gratitude and positive emotion immediately reduce stress in the body because they reduce threat. So another simple thing besides belly breathing is just, what do you like? And if you ask somebody what they like, and you'll notice their eyes will go off to the right where people's, that's where they bring those memories, then within 5 or 7 seconds their body has quieted down just by thinking of what they like. So that's another very simple one. A third one to reduce stress is, what good do you do in the world? Yeah. Focus on it. And another one is, we always teach people how to say no. Because some of the great stress in our culture now is overwhelm. And you need to be able to say no. And so we give practice and the techniques for no thank you, what part of no don't you understand, stuff like that.
So interestingly, what I find is all of these are things that come from inside. It seems like all you're doing is a shift in consciousness. It's not a change in externalities. It's not something I put through my mouth that causes the stress reduction. It's an internal shift you're asking us to do.
You can take some nutraceuticals that might lower some of the arousal and change your neurotransmitters. But let me tell you that it's not that simple as what you just described, because you still sometimes have to operate in the world. So we may have jobs that are demanding. And the job may in and of itself cause some stress. But as long as we have too much adrenaline in our body, we're not going to be able to think clearly about how to handle the outside problem. So while stress management may work on the body and the mind, its goal is often to calm you down enough so you can think clearly about how to deal successfully with what you have to deal with.
I see.
So it's not just that you're sitting there like this. Right. It's that changes the neuroarchitecture and changes some of the transmission of neurotransmitters and all that stuff, so that you can then think in a way that helps you solve your problem.
And is this something that can be wired into your body and brain? Meaning, if I were to do these practices, the gratitude practice, or do yoga more regularly, or train myself to deep breathe, am I shifting something inside in how my brain is composed, how my body is, so that over a period of time I'm getting better and better at it and less stressed?
There's a very basic homeostatic mechanism that we all have that's a set point. Okay. That set point is partly genetic and partly practice and environment. So let's just say somebody's set point is here. Yeah. If they get into an environment where there's a lot of stress or a lot of demand, that set point might raise so that higher becomes normal. Yeah. Practices can lower it back down. I see. So that your very arousal and what's normal to your body can shift depending on your environment and your response. The other thing is, so that's a physiologic wiring that regulates your heart rate and regulates your entire nervous system response. Separate from that, there are all sorts of brain systems and neurological systems that can subtly shift through the practice of quiet, meditation, focusing, and unaroused consciousness. I see. That the way the neurons fire, the way the blood flow it goes, and the way the neurotransmitters will subtly shift over time.
And I believe this is the kind of research that Dr. Richard Davidson is doing at the University of Wisconsin, and working with monks from the Dalai Lama's school to see how the brain can rewire itself as they go into deep states of meditation.
Well, and people have been doing this for 30 or 40 years. Yeah. What he has done is show through functional MRIs the very specific neuroarchitecture changes. People, the generation before that, did it through the cardiovascular system. They'd show you could lower blood pressure, you could lower heart rate through the same kind of practices.
I see. And an interesting thing I found in your work, in your research and book is, so a lot of people carry resentment because somebody did something in particular in their own mind. Yeah. But you also work with entire communities and societies where the hurt may be that my tribe did not get justice from this other tribe, or my culture got treated badly, or my country got treated badly. Right. So even with where no one did you any harm in particular, but this perceived notion that your entire race, or culture, or breed got upset. Yeah. And so you seem to be one of the few people who have taken forgiveness to that level.
It's hard. I mean, because our culture becomes so pervasive for how we even see things that we don't even realize the resentments and contempt that we have that we think is normal based on who our enemies are, based on our culture. So one of the easiest ways to see that in the United States is Republicans versus Democrats. If you get a Democrat, they're going to say nasty things about Republicans without even realizing how nasty they are. Right. Republicans do the same thing. In a community like this, you will find people like going like this about Rush Limbaugh, you know what I'm saying? Or, you know, or George Bush, or it's like...
deep anger and resentment,
And just their whole... because that's their culture. Yeah. You go to a red state and not a blue state, and it's often the same thing. Yeah. And we don't even realize how triggered we are.
Correct. And it seems like, at the end of the day, what you're saying is you can bring it to very, very simple levels like what we started with. By forgiving, you actually become a kinder person. Kinder towards yourself, kinder towards others.
Yes.
And through kindness, you actually go on a path to happiness.
That's what the research shows.
Yes. All right, Dr. Luskin, thank you very much. A pleasure having you on the show.
You're very welcome.
You know, you've been in conversation with Dr. Fred Luskin, author of Forgive for Good, a simple, straightforward method by which forgiveness can lead to kindness, and kindness can ultimately lead to happiness. Dr. Luskin, thank you for being on the show.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Good. So that was good. And
we done?
Just a conversation. Yeah.
Okay. No, I just didn't know.